Last segment, we talked about the 2010 election. And if you recall, I mentioned that Nouri al-Maliki, after 8 months, was able to form a government. And I also mentioned that by 2010, when the second parliamentary election took place in Iraq, the fighting had sharply diminished. And therefore, there was enough political space for this election to take place. However, the viciousness of the fighting just a few years back and the concern with the accumulation of power on the part of the Shiites and also the polarization that had taken in Iraq, taken shape in Iraq over secular government versus a more religious government, and also the ethnic division as opposed to sectarian, the Arab versus the Kurds. All of these divides, the sectarian divide, Sunni versus Shiite, the secular religious divide, and the ethnic divide, Kurds versus the Arabs, all of these had made it very difficult to form a viable government. Consequently, once the election had occurred, it took close to 8 months before Nouri al-Maliki was able to form his government. And the next slide that I want to show will show the result of that election in terms of party politics in Iraq. So the political parties and the coalition that led to the two that were involved in the 2010 election, if you look at them in terms of coalition parties that make up the coalition seats and the percentage of the seats that they got, the first one is the National Alliance Coalition, and that coalition consisted of two, let me call them parties, but even they are themselves coalition within a coalition. One, of course, is the State of Law Coalition, 89 seats. This was al-Maliki's coalition, made up of almost entirely of Shiite parties, religious Shiite parties. And the other one was National Iraqi Alliance. They got 70 seats. So together, they ended up having 159 seats out of the 325 seats in the parliament. And their percentage was around 49%. The second one was a very important one, Al-Araqiya Coalition. Primary party was Al-Araqiya. They got even more seats than al-Maliki's with 91 seats. So this was by far the biggest, this was a party that got the most seats. Now, Al-Araqiya Coalition is led by a secular Shiite by the name of Ayad Alawi, who was a former prime minister in Iraq briefly during the various government after the invasion. And he also worked for the CIA, so in some ways his credential with the Shiites was very, very low. This was working with CIA, of course, prior to the invasion. And also joining him for that coalition was a Sunni leader, Saleh al-Multaq. Now, this coalition really had a very impressive showing. They got most of the Sunni secular votes, even though their leader, had he been able to put together a winning coalition, it would have been the prime minister was himself a Shiite, but he was a secular Shiite, and therefore the Sunnis trusted him. And he had that coalition, as I mentioned, had 91 seats compared to al-Maliki's 89. So that meant that Maliki had to form another coalition with the National Iraqi Alliance in order to form a government, plus, that gave him 49% of the seat, plus be able to add a few more to have a majority in the seat. So Al-Araqiya got in total 28%. The Kurdish Alliance, they got about 49 seats, and they're composed of several various Kurdish parties, and that amounted to about 15% of the seats. and finally dumping everyone else in the other categories. They had a total of 24 seats, and they were kind of swing group that would go with one or the other. After the election, December 15, 2001 is a very important date for the United States. It really marks the official end of the United States military presence in Iraq after the invasion. And it was announced by President Obama's Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, at Baghdad International Airport. So in the end of 2001, we are pretty much finished with our military presence in Iraq. It would have probably lasted, we were willing to stay there longer, but we had demanded some concession related to the prosecution of American soldiers in case they commit or violate Iraqi laws. That essentially would have meant that Iraqi courts would have no jurisdiction, and no Iraqi government would be willing to accept that unless there are puppets. So when we couldn't reach an agreement on that, we decided that we're going to pull out. So now let me briefly review the regional winners and the losers of the United States invasion. So let me begin with the winners. Who were the winners in that war? Excuse me. A big winner was, without a doubt, the Iraqi courts. The Kurds are the winner almost without any qualification, because this is the closest they have come to have achieved their centuries-old dream of moving toward their own state or having their own state. You may recall that back in 1990s, when we imposed a no-fly zone in the aftermath of the first Gulf War in 1990-1991, the no-fly zone really helped sequester that area of northern Iraq for the Kurds, and they were able to get a lot of autonomy. So clearly they're far better off today than they had been perhaps since 1920s, and certainly much better off than they were under Iraq. And there's no question that they are moving, they're very desirous of achieving statehood, and they're going to do everything in their power to accomplish that in the future. And that, of course, bodes ill for integrity of Iraq as a state that has Kurds as one of their ethnic groups. The other winner were also Iraqi Shiites. Remember, they're the oppressed majority, and they comprise over 60% of the Iraqi population. And since the creation of Iraq after World War I, they have remained under the yoke of the Sunnis. Overall, one can say that they are certainly better off because they're in control of Iraq, and therefore they also benefited from the war. The other beneficiary is the country next door, Iran. Thanks to United States invasion, Iran's longtime enemy, Saddam Hussein, was removed. Many of the officials that are now running Iraq, many of them stayed in Iran as exiles during Saddam's reign, and so they have very close ties with Iran. And Iran, therefore, because it had given sanctuary to these officials and these political leaders, they are having a very good relation. Finally, one has to include as a winner Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and we have to put him in the winners column. Remember that they had suffered a devastating defeat in Afghanistan in the hands of the United States and of their Afghani allies. The movement was all but defeated. Their leadership had been either killed or on the run in caves, and therefore they were in deep trouble and were almost rendered irrelevant. The United States invasion of Iraq, however, gave the movement a second lease on life. Remember that Al-Qaeda's mantra before the invasion was that the United States ultimately wants to colonize all of the Middle East, and suddenly that mantra after the invasion of the United States began to seem more plausible to the Arabs. Also the initial reference to Iraqi operation, or to our response to, if you remember, to 9/11 by President Bush, calling this, if you recall, he said he called it a crusade. That reference reminded the Arabs of the famous crusade, and so Al-Qaeda preyed on this, and so therefore President Bush actually, using that metaphor, helped revive that idea and gave credibility after the invasion of Iraq to the Al-Qaeda's charge that the United States really wants to control all of Middle East. And the Greater Middle East Initiative also meant this. So from the Arab, and especially from the Islamic perspective, this spread of democracy was nothing other than a spread of Western hegemony, Western values on these Islamic nations. So these were the real winners. So who were the losers in the region? The losers, I would put first and foremost the Iraqi Sunnis. They were the 20%, they constitute about 20% of the population. They were the people that were privileged, and they ruled over the 80% of the population, the Kurds and Shiites. And these minorities, the Iraqi minorities, were really therefore used to ruling over the disenfranchised majority. Some of them have now resorted to terror tactics, bombing the Shiites to get their revenge. And later on, when we bring in the impact of the Syrian war, you will see that now they're thinking of possibility of working with the Syrian Sunnis. The other big loser, by all, almost by consensus, had to be Saudi Arabia. They could not believe that they will see a day when a major Arab country, Iraq, is going to be governed by Shiites. And so for them, this was a disastrous development. They got very much involved, and they really played a very key role in exacerbating the Sunni Shiite conflict by helping the Sunnis and encourage them to take on the Shiites. And therefore, the Saudis have been extremely angry at the United States for the Iraq war, and especially the outcome of that war leading to the domination by the Shiites.